When you think of obedience, what comes to mind? Maybe a soldier following orders, a citizen obeying laws, or a child listening to a parent. We often imagine obedience as something forced upon us, a response to authority, punishment, or power. But what if I told you that the most powerful form of obedience isn't enforced by anyone? It's something we do to ourselves, often without even realizing it. The most common obedience is psychological, and it's far more subtle and stronger than any external force. It all starts in early childhood. As kids, we're like sponges, soaking up the world around us. A smile of approval from a parent teaches us what's good. A frown of disapproval tells us what to avoid. These simple signals, repeated thousands of times, build the foundation of our behavior. They form deep patterns in our minds that guide our actions long before we ever learn about laws or logic. We learn to conform not because we're forced, but because we crave acceptance and want to avoid rejection. This is the very beginning of social obedience. It's not about rules written in a book. It's about the unwritten rules of human connection. As we grow up, this internal programming expands. We step into a larger society that operates on shared beliefs, routines, and expectations. Think about it. Why do you stand in line at the grocery store instead of just cutting to the front? There's probably no police officer there to stop you. You do it because everyone else does it. It feels normal, right, and fair. This is social obedience in action. We followed these invisible scripts because we've internalized them as the correct way to behave. Society doesn't need to watch our every move, because we police ourselves. Our belief that these rules are necessary and moral is what truly maintains order. This automatic obedience is incredibly efficient. It allows millions of people to coexist peacefully, to coordinate complex activities, and to build stable communities. But it also has a downside. Because it's so automatic, we rarely question it. We follow routines and accept norms without asking why. We might go to a certain school, choose a particular career, or even hold specific beliefs simply because it's what's expected. This is where psychological obedience shows its true strength. It's stronger than any physical control because it comes from within. It's the voice in our head that tells us to fit in, to not make waves, and to follow the crowd. So why do humans so rarely resist this kind of obedience? The answer is comfort and safety. Stepping outside of social norms can be terrifying. It risks judgment, isolation, and conflict. Conforming, on the other hand, feels safe. It gives us a sense of belonging and predictability. Our brains are wired to prefer the path of least resistance, and in a social world, that path is almost always the one paved by conformity. Resisting requires a conscious effort to challenge beliefs that we've held our entire lives. It means questioning the very fabric of our social reality, which can be an uncomfortable and lonely process. By understanding the psychology behind obedience, we can start to see how societies truly function. It's not just about governments and laws. It's about the quiet, invisible forces that shape our thoughts and actions every single day. The most effective control isn't physical, it's mental. It's the shared story we all agree to live by. Recognizing this allows us to be more mindful of our own behavior. We can ask ourselves, am I doing this because I truly believe in it, or am I just following a script? This self-awareness is the first step toward genuine freedom of thought and action. It empowers us to choose our path, not just follow the one laid out for us. The first topic is why humans learn to obey. Obedience didn't start as weakness. It began as a tool for survival. Picture this: early humans living in small, tight-knit groups. For them, cooperation wasn't a choice. It was the only way to live. Disobedience, on the other hand, often meant death. Think about it: hunting massive animals, protecting the group from predators, and making sure everyone had enough to eat all of it required perfect coordination. If one person decided to go off and do their own thing, it put the entire group at risk. In that world, following the rules wasn't about being good or bad, right or wrong. It was purely about making it to the next sunrise. Over thousands of years, the behaviors that kept people alive were repeated. And what happens when you repeat something enough times? It becomes a habit. That habit then creates an expectation within the group. Everyone is expected to act in a certain way because that's what has always worked. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, that expectation hardened into what we now call obedience. It wasn't a sudden command from a powerful leader. It was a gradual, organic process born from the simple, relentless need to survive. As these small groups started to grow larger, things got more complicated. Simple cooperation wasn't enough anymore. Imagine a group of 100 people trying to decide where to hunt or when to move camp. It would be chaos. Someone had to make the final call. Someone had to lead. This is where authority began to emerge. And interestingly, it wasn't always the strongest person who took charge. Often, it was the person with the most experience, the oldest member, or someone who was seen as particularly wise. People started to obey them, not because they were forced to, but because it made life simpler and safer. It reduced the overwhelming uncertainty of the world. This brings us to a really important psychological point. As humans, we are wired to prefer a predictable, orderly world over one filled with uncertain freedom. Obedience offered that predictability. It was a mental shortcut. Instead of having to analyze every single decision and weigh every possible outcome, people could just trust the established norms and the leader's direction. This freed up mental energy for other things, making daily life much easier. Following the path was simply safer and less exhausting than trying to forge a new one, all on your own every single day. Once obedience proved its usefulness time and time again, it started to become a valued trait. And once something is valued by a society, it gets taught to the next generation. Children weren't just raised. They were raised inside these structures of obedience. They didn't learn it through force, at least not at first. They learned it through imitation. They watched their parents and other adults, seeing what behaviors were rewarded with praise and acceptance, and what behaviors were punished with disapproval or exclusion. Slowly but surely, they internalized a fundamental lesson. Fitting in means safety. On the flip side, disobedience became linked with danger. This wasn't always the immediate physical danger of being attacked by an animal. It was a social danger, which for a deeply social species like ours, can be just as terrifying. The threat of being isolated, rejected by the group, and losing the trust of your peers is a powerful motivator. We are hardwired to avoid that feeling of being cast out. This is the critical point where obedience shifted from being just a behavior for survival into a deep-seated part of our psychology. It became emotionally charged by the time the first great civilizations began to form, with their cities, laws, and kings. Obedience was no longer just a conscious response to an immediate threat. It had become a learned instinct. It felt natural. People obeyed their rulers, their elders, their traditions, and their customs, often without a second thought. They did it because obedience itself felt right, and questioning authority felt inherently risky and wrong. The very act of defiance triggered a primal alarm bell in their minds, a warning of social isolation that had been programmed over countless generations. So, when we look back at the history of human society, it is crucial to understand that obedience was some evil invention suddenly imposed on the weak by the powerful. It evolved naturally, hand in hand with our own development as a species. It grew from the soil of necessity, and once it became a natural part of our social fabric, it became incredibly difficult to separate the act of obeying from our own sense of identity. To obey was to be a good member of the tribe, a good citizen, a good person. It was woven into the very definition of who we were. This psychological foundation is incredibly powerful, and it helps explain why obedience can be so hard to question, even today. The instinct to follow is ancient and deep. It whispers to us that conformity is safe and rebellion is dangerous. This isn't to say obedience is always good or always bad. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for cooperation and progress, or for control and oppression. But understanding its origin story, seeing it not as a simple moral failing but as a complex, evolved survival strategy is the first step toward navigating its power wisely in our own lives and in our modern world. It allows us to ask the important questions. Whom are we obeying? Why are we obeying? And is this obedience still serving us? The second topic is fear, belonging, and approval. Ever wonder why we follow the rules, even when no one's watching? It's not always about logic or force. It's about something much deeper, something wired into our very DNA, the need to belong. Think about it. From the moment we're born, our survival depends on others. Being part of a group means safety, food, and comfort. Being cast out means danger. It's a primal instinct. Early societies figured this out. Instead of ruling with an iron fist all the time, they created a much smarter system: approval and disapproval. If you followed the rules, you were praised. You were a good member of the tribe. If you stepped out of line, you were shamed. You were made to feel like an outsider. This system was incredibly effective. Soon, people didn't need the threat of physical punishment. The fear of simply losing approval, of being shamed or excluded, was enough to keep them in line. This fear is subtle but incredibly powerful. It asks the little voice in your head that makes you hesitate before speaking your mind in a meeting. It's that feeling of anxiety when you wear something different from everyone else. It's the instinct to self-correct, to fit in, to not rock the boat. We learn to read the room, to sense the invisible boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not. Our desire for belonging becomes conditional. You are accepted as long as you obey. This is how control shifts from being external to internal. It becomes psychological. We start policing ourselves. We feel guilt not because we've actually hurt someone, but because we've broken an unwritten rule or disappointed an expectation. We've crossed a line, and that fear of being judged, of being labeled strange, or difficult, or disloyal, can be paralyzing. Fear doesn't always roar like a lion. Most of the time, it whispers. It shows up as hesitation, as silence when you wish you had spoken up, as quiet compliance. We trade a piece of our authentic selves for the comfort of fitting in. And it's a tempting trade, because obedience does offer rewards. It gives us stability, a sense of predictability. It offers recognition and a clear identity. Being normal feels safe. Following the same path as everyone else creates a sense of unity. And in unity, there is strength and security. It's a powerful feeling. This cycle gets stronger with each generation. We don't just teach our children the rules of society. We teach them the emotional responses that go with those rules. They learn to feel pride when they conform, and anxiety when they deviate. This conditioning is so deep that eventually, we stop questioning the rules themselves. The primary question is no longer does this rule make sense, or is this rule fair? Instead, it becomes, if I do this, will I still be accepted? That's the critical turning point. That's when obedience becomes second nature. Not because we are being forced by some external authority, but because our deepest, most human desire is to connect, to be part of something, to belong. We choose to obey because the alternative, the loneliness of being an outsider, feels far more frightening. The cage is not locked from the outside, we are holding the key, choosing to stay inside for the comfort of the familiar. But what happens when the rules of the group conflict with our own conscience? What happens when belonging requires us to be silent in the face of injustice? This is the true test. The fear of exclusion is real, but so is the quiet strength of our own integrity. Throughout history, real change has always been sparked by those brave enough to risk their sense of belonging for what they believed was right. They were the ones who dared to ask if the rules were just, not just if they were popular. So, the next time you feel that pull to conform, take a moment. Acknowledge that deep, human need for acceptance. It's not a weakness. It's part of who we are. But also ask yourself, what is the price of this belonging? Is it your voice? Is it your values? True belonging, the kind that truly nourishes the soul, isn't about conforming. It's about finding the people who accept you for who you are, not for who they want you to be. It's about building communities where different ideas aren't a threat, but a source of strength. And that starts with each of us having the courage to be ourselves, even when we're afraid. The third topic is obedience without force. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're rediving deep into a concept that is foundational to how societies function, and it's probably not what you think. We're talking about control, but not the kind that involves handcuffs or dictatorships. We're talking about the most effective, most pervasive kind of control, obedience without force. Think about it. The moment a system has to rely on open threats or violent force to make people comply, that system is already showing signs of failure. True efficiency and control isn't about the threat of punishment. It's about making punishment irrelevant. The power move happens when obedience is internalized. This is when society no longer needs to constantly threaten you or patrol you. You start regulating yourself. You behave exactly according to expectations, even when there's nobody watching, even when you know you could get away with something. This is the point where control becomes not just efficient, but almost entirely invisible. How does this silent control work? It relies on subtle signals. We are wired to be incredibly sensitive to social feedback. A quick look, a tone of voice, a withdrawn response, or even a moment of charged silence. These social cues can correct behavior faster and more profoundly than any formal punishment. We automatically adjust ourselves to avoid social discomfort. This is why many of us follow rules we've never actually read, and obey norms we cannot explain or logically defend. We just know the expected path. Institutions are the essential pillars here. Think about your experience in schools, in workplaces, in religious settings, and even within your family structure. They all consistently reinforce the same patterns of behavior. They don't usually threaten you with jail time. Instead, they reward compliance with highly valuable assets: stability, inclusion, and career progression. And conversely, they discourage resistance or deviation by offering the opposite: uncertainty, social isolation, and professional stagnation. You don't need a manual detailing the consequences of disobedience. You sense it deeply and instinctively. Over time, this process turns obedience into a simple habit of thought. We start to assume limitations without ever being explicitly instructed. We just know what questions are too much to ask in a meeting. We know which ideas are unsafe to bring up at the dinner table. We understand which behaviors will lead to quiet, administrative, but very real consequences. This preemptive awareness shapes our choices long before we ever actually act. And here's the most brilliant part of this structure. Obedience without force feels entirely voluntary. People genuinely believe they are making free choices. And in many ways, they are, but only within boundaries that were set long ago and are now invisible. This illusion of choice is critical. When people feel overtly controlled, they push back, they resist, they fight. But when people feel autonomous, yet their choices lead them down the prescribed path, they comply enthusiastically. Social obedience thrives because it offers highly desired comforts, routine, predictability, and order. It frames order as protection because life continues smoothly and because the system is safe and predictable. Most of us never take the time to notice how much of our decision space has already been quietly decided for us. Force generates fear, yes, but internalized obedience creates loyalty. That is why the strongest, most enduring social systems rarely need to resort to violence. They don't need force. They rely entirely on your willing participation. It's fascinating to realize how much of our compliance is self-imposed, isn't it? Let me know in the comments what you think about this invisible structure of control. Have you ever noticed yourself making a choice based purely on assumed social boundaries? If you found this deep dive interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that challenges the way you see the world. The fourth topic is when rules feel natural. We're diving into the final stage of social obedience today, and it's the most fascinating and perhaps the most insidious. It's when rules stop feeling like rules at all. This is the stage of normalization. At this point, expectations are no longer questioned because they are experienced as common sense. People don't ask why things are done a certain way. They simply say, that's just how it is. This is where obedience reaches its deepest, most profound level. When rules feel natural, alternatives automatically feel unrealistic. It becomes difficult, even painful, to imagine a different system. We confuse familiarity with necessity and longevity with truth. Because something has been around for a long time, we assume it must be correct or the only way. Our language reinforces this constantly. Words like normal, proper, respectful, and realistic quietly but powerfully shape our behavior every single day. Anything that falls outside these invisible linguistic boundaries is dismissed before it can even be properly explored or considered. Culture plays an enormous role here. Traditions are repeated without context. Customs are preserved without any critical examination. The past becomes a justification, a shield, instead of a source of understanding. Think about why we defend certain rules, especially those we didn't even create. Often, it's because those rules provide structure to our identity. If you question the rules, it feels like questioning yourself, questioning your family, or questioning your entire place in society. It becomes an existential threat. At this stage, obedience is no longer just external. It lives inside our thought patterns. Even those who sense that something is fundamentally wrong may remain completely silent. And it's not because they are convinced that the system is right. It's because resistance feels incredibly lonely. And loneliness, for a social species like us, is one of the strongest deterrents imaginable. The system does not need to silence everyone with overt force. It only needs to make the act of questioning feel deeply uncomfortable, perhaps even shameful. This is how control maintains itself successfully across generations. Each new generation inherits not just the rules themselves, but the emotional responses to those rules. Comfort and obedience, and a powerful, nagging anxiety and deviation. When rules feel natural, freedom doesn't disappear violently, with a bang or a clash. It simply fades quietly into the background, almost unnoticeably. And that, ultimately, is why social obedience is so enduring, not because it is constantly enforced by outside pressure, but because eventually it becomes completely and utterly familiar. If this idea resonates with you, or if you've ever felt that internal struggle between common sense and critical thought, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into human behavior. The fifth topic is awareness and the limits of control. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we do the things we do? Why we follow certain rules, traditions, or social norms without a second thought? It feels like we're all part of a giant, intricate system playing roles we never consciously chose. But what if I told you that this system, no matter how powerful it seems, has a fundamental weakness, a tiny crack that can change everything? and that crack is awareness. Let's think about it. Every system of control, from the rules in our families to the laws of our society, relies on one thing: our automatic, unquestioning obedience. It's efficient. It keeps things running smoothly. We learn from a young age to listen, to follow, to fit in. This conditioning is so deep that most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. It's like breathing. But what happens when you start paying attention to your breath? It changes. It becomes a conscious act. The same is true for obedience. Awareness begins with the simplest of questions. Why did we do this? Who decided this was the way it should be? And what would actually happen if we chose a different path? These questions might seem small, even insignificant, but they are incredibly powerful. They act like a wedge, slowly prying open the lid of automatic behavior. They interrupt the program. Once a person becomes truly aware of social conditioning, they can never go back to following blindly. Even if they still choose to obey, for practical reasons or for safety, their obedience is now a conscious choice. And there is a world of difference between conditioned obedience and conscious obedience. The first is a reflex. The second is an act of agency. Conditioned obedience says, I must. Conscious obedience says, I choose to. For now, this shift in perspective is revolutionary. Awareness doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out and break every rule. It's not about instant rebellion or tearing down the system overnight. It's much more subtle, and in many ways, it's about reshaping the system from within, starting with your own mind. When you become aware, you start to see that many of the rules we live by are not unchangeable laws of nature, like gravity. They are human constructions. They were created by people for specific purposes, sometimes for order and stability, which can be good, but other times for control and maintaining power. This single realization grants you an immense sense of psychological freedom. It's like discovering you've been playing a game without knowing the rules, and suddenly someone hands you the rulebook. Now you can play strategically. This newfound freedom is about choice. It is about having the clarity to understand when a rule serves a genuine purpose and is worth following, and when it's an outdated relic or a tool of manipulation that deserves to be questioned. It means recognizing that belonging to a group, a community, or a society should never require you to silence your own thoughts or your own conscience. True belonging thrives on authentic contribution, not on silent compliance. Think about the great shifts in human history. They didn't happen overnight. They began as whispers of awareness in the minds of a few individuals, which then spread like wildfire. As more and more people started asking those simple questions, why and what if, the collective consciousness began to change. Old, rigid traditions that no longer served the people began to soften and adapt. Hierarchical structures that were once seen as absolute and permanent revealed their flexibility. This is the natural limit of social obedience. Control, in its purest form, depends on being invisible. It works best when we don't know it's there. Awareness shines a light on it. It makes the invisible visible. And once we can see the mechanics of how obedience works, how we've been conditioned, and why we regain our mental autonomy, we stop seeing society as this huge, unchangeable force that dictates our lives. Instead, we begin to see it for what it truly is: a living, breathing system that is constantly being shaped and reshaped by the choices and actions of the people within it, including you, including me. This changes everything. It means we're not just passive cogs in a machine. We are active participants. We have influence, our awareness, our questions, our conscious choices. They all contribute to the evolution of the world around us. The focus shifts away from a model of dominance and control towards one of cooperation and mutual understanding. Instead of a pyramid with power concentrated at the top, it becomes more like a network, where influence flows in all directions. So, where does true freedom begin? It doesn't start with a dramatic act of rebellion or breaking the rules for the sake of it. That's just reacting to the system on its own terms. True freedom starts much earlier. It starts with a quiet, internal act of understanding the rules. It starts with asking why they exist, who they serve, and whether they still make sense. Once that understanding takes root in your mind, absolute control becomes impossible. You may still live within the system, but you are no longer a prisoner of it. You navigate it with awareness, with intention, and with the knowledge that you have a choice. This is the ultimate power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to see, to understand, and to consciously choose your own path. And once that flame of awareness is lit, it can never be completely extinguished. Thank you so much for joining me on this thought journey today. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What rules have you started to question? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content that challenges the way we see the world. Until next time, stay aware.